I'm Edward, your host, and it's a pleasure to share this quiet moment with you. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And do you have a favourite toy or special object when you were a child? Write it below and subscribe for a new mystery every day. Now settle back and enjoy the story. Chapter 1. The Passing Everyone Expected. The news reached Miss Marple shortly after breakfast, delivered by Mrs. Hartnell, who had encountered de Metcalfe on his early rounds and had, as was her custom, made it her business to inquire after the general health of the village. Mr. Hargreaves passed away during the night, Mrs. Hartnell announced, settling herself into the chair by the morning-room window, with the air of one who brings information rather than tragedy. Quite peacefully, Dr. Metcalfe said, in his sleep, which is a blessing at his age. Miss Marple looked up from the letter she had been reading, a communication from a niece in London regarding spring bulbs, and set it aside with the careful attention one gives to news that requires proper consideration, however little it surprises. Poor Mr. Hargreaves, she said quietly, though I suppose we have all been expecting it these past months. Indeed we have, Mrs. Hartnell agreed, adjusting her gloves in a manner that suggested the matter had been anticipated so thoroughly that grief would be somewhat redundant. He had been failing noticeably since Christmas. Dr. Metcalfe had warned him about remaining alone in that cottage, but he would have his independence. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Lionel Hargreaves had been a fixture of St. Mary Mead for more years than most villagers cared to count. A solitary gentleman of advancing years who had lived in the small stone cottage at the eastern edge of the village, just beyond the churchyard wall, he had been the sort of man who occupied a place in village life without quite belonging to it, courteous when encountered, regular in his habits, but possessed of a privacy that discouraged familiarity. He had made arrangements, I believe, Mr. Marple observed, her fingers resuming their gentle work on the pale blue wool in her lap. For his affairs, I mean. He struck me as the sort of person who would wish everything to be in order. Oh, yes, all attended to months ago, Mrs. Hartnell confirmed, with the satisfaction of one who approved of such foresight. Mr. Petherick handled everything, the will, the cottage, various small bequests, very sensible. It shows a thoughtful nature, making things easy for those left behind. Miss Marple made a small sound of agreement, though her eyes had taken on that distant, considering quality that meant her mind was following some thread invisible to others. The morning proceeded as mornings do in villages, when death arrives punctually and without undue disturbance. The church bell tolled at the appropriate hour. Conversations at the baker's and the post office acknowledged the passing with the measured sympathy reserved for conclusions that carry no element of shock. Mr. Hargreaves had been elderly, increasingly frail, and had lived alone by choice. That he should die in the night seemed less an event than a quiet closing of accounts. Yet as Miss Marple went about her day, tending to her garden where the first brave crocuses were pushing through the cold earth, exchanging greetings with Miss Hartwell outside the draper's, pausing to admire the new lamb in Farmer Giles's lower field, she became aware of something that was not quite sorrow and not quite relief, but rather a peculiar attentiveness that seemed to have settled over the village like late winter mist. People spoke of Mr. Hargreaves with appropriate respect. They recalled his punctuality at church services, his generous contribution to the roof repair fund, his quiet dignity, but beneath these proper acknowledgments Miss Marple detected something else, a watchfulness, as though the village were waiting to see what would happen next, or perhaps what would not happen. She encountered the vicar, Mr. Clement, outside the lich gate that afternoon. He was a kindly man, earnest in his duties and inclined toward thoughtfulness rather than eloquence. "A sad business, Miss Marple," he said, though his tone suggested more concern than grief. "Though I suppose we must all come to it in time." Mr. Hargreaves seemed to accept his mortality with great composure. He was not a man given to complaint, Miss Marple agreed. No, indeed. The vicar hesitated, as though there were something more he wished to say but could not quite formulate. He was very settled in his mind, I believe, very much at peace with his decisions. It was an odd way to phrase it, Miss Marple thought. Not at peace with his life or his conscience, but with his decisions. as though Mr. Hargreaves had made choices that required peace to be made with them. "Had you visited him recently?" she inquired gently. "Mrs. Crane saw to most of his needs these past months," Mr. Clement replied, and there was something almost relieved in his tone, as though he were grateful to hand that responsibility to someone else. She was most attentive, collected his letters, managed his errands, sat with him in the evenings, a very Christian spirit of charity. Mrs. Edith Crane was a widow of middle years, respectable and capable, who lived in one of the newer houses on the Lambton Road. She had come to St. Mary Mead some 5 years earlier, a relative newcomer by village standards, and had gradually established herself through quiet competence rather than social ambition. She served on the church flower committee, contributed to worthy causes, and was known for her practical kindness toward those in need of assistance. "Mrs. Crane has been very good," Miss Marple observed. "It cannot have been easy tending to someone so private in his nature." "She managed admirably," the vicar said. "Mr. Hargreaves trusted her completely, I believe. Gave her quite a free hand with his correspondence and household matters. A great comfort to him in his final months." After the vicar had departed, Miss Marple stood for a moment in the pale afternoon light, considering. There was nothing wrong in what had been said. Mrs. Crane had indeed been attentive. Mr. Hargreaves had indeed trusted her. These were facts that did credit to all concerned. And yet, Miss Marple had lived long enough to recognise when a village was too uniformly satisfied with an explanation. She had observed over many years that when people speak approvingly of the same arrangement using nearly the same words, it is often because they have agreed, whether consciously or not, to leave certain questions unasked. That evening, as she sat by her fire with her knitting, she reflected on the curious quality of this day's conversations. Everyone had known what to say about Mr. Hargreaves. Everyone had mentioned Mrs. Crane's kindness. Everyone had expressed the appropriate degree of regret qualified by the appropriate degree of acceptance. It was all very proper and very reasonable. Too reasonable, perhaps. In Miss Marple's experience, villagers dealt with death in two ways. With genuine sorrow that was messy and particular and full of contradictions, or with relief that people tried very hard to disguise as regret. What she had observed today was neither. It was something more subtle, a collective composure that seemed to rest not on grief overcome, but on something completed, something finished according to plan. She thought of Mrs. Crane's capable presence in Mr. Hargreaves's final months. She thought of the vicar's odd phrasing about decisions and peace. She thought of the watchful quality that lingered beneath the villagers' proper sympathy. And she thought, as she had thought many times before in her long life, that the most dangerous assumptions are the ones that everyone makes together. Mr. Hargreaves's death had surprised no one. His affairs had been in order. Mrs. Crane had been commendably attentive. The village had accepted his passing with appropriate calm. All very satisfactory, all very neat. Perhaps, Miss Marple reflected, as her needles clicked softly in the quiet room, a little too neat. Death, in her experience, rarely arranged itself quite so obligingly. And when it did, there was usually a reason that had nothing to do with convenience and everything to do with intention. But these were merely impressions, the small unease that comes from watching people agree too readily about matters that should provoke more varied responses. Nothing more than that. Not yet. Outside, the late winter evening drew in with its accustomed chill. In his cottage beyond the churchyard wall, Mr. Lionel Hargreaves lay in the stillness that awaits the undertaker's attention, his affairs in order, his decisions made, his secrets, if he had any, presumably buried with him. Presumably. Miss Marple set down her knitting and gazed into the fire, her mind turning over the day's small observations like a patient hand sorting through a basket of tangled threads, looking for the one that did not quite belong. She would wait, she decided. She would watch, she would listen. For in a village, nothing was ever quite as finished as it appeared. Chapter 2. Reactions that did not agree. The funeral took place on a grey Thursday afternoon, attended by a respectable gathering that filled perhaps half the church pews, a turnout that suggested duty acknowledged rather than affection mourned. Miss Marple, seated in her customary place near the side aisle, observed the congregation with the quiet attention she habitually brought to such occasions. Funerals, in her experience, revealed a great deal about the deceased through the manner in which the living chose to remember them. More precisely, they revealed what the living wished to believe about both the departed and themselves. Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, sat near the front, a thin, precise man whose attendance was clearly professional rather than personal. Behind him were the prices from the village shop, wearing expressions of polite solemnity. Mrs. Hartnell occupied her usual position, handkerchief at the ready, though her eyes remained quite dry. Colonel Bantry and wife had come, as they came to all the village functions, representing the larger house and longer lineage with their customary graciousness. What struck Miss Marple was not who had come, but the quality of their attention. They listened to the vicar's words with appropriate seriousness, yet there was an absence of that particular weight that accompanies genuine grief. Instead, she detected something closer to conclusion, as though they had gathered not to mourn a life ended, but to witness a matter properly closed. Mrs. Crane sat alone in the third pew, dressed in black that was sombre without being dramatic. Her composure was perfect. She held herself with the quiet dignity of one who had earned the right to grieve privately, and yet Miss Marple noticed that her hands remained still in her lap, untroubled by the small fidgets that usually betray emotion held in check. After the service, the mourners gathered in small clusters outside the church, their conversations muted but not subdued. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Price and positioned herself near the wall where the afternoon sun had found a patch of warmth. "A very dignified service," Mrs. Price observed, balancing her own cup with practised ease. "Mr. Hargreaves would have approved, I think. Nothing excessive." "He was not a man who sought attention," Miss Marple agreed. "No, indeed, very self-contained." Mrs. Price lowered her voice slightly, though of course Mrs. Crane knew him better than most of us in these last months. Such devotion. We're almost grateful to her. It was the second time that day Miss Marple had heard someone express gratitude on behalf of the collective we. The first had been from Miss Hartwell, who had remarked that we all feel such relief that he wasn't alone at the end. The phrasing had been nearly identical, as though drawn from a shared vocabulary of acceptable sentiment. Mrs. Crane was very attentive, Miss Marple said carefully. "Oh, wonderfully so," Mrs. Price enthused, reading to him in the evenings, managing his correspondence, even helping with his meals toward the end. She quite took over his household affairs, really. Such a burden to assume, and all out of pure Christian charity. Miss Marple made a small sound of acknowledgement. There was nothing in Mrs. Price's words to dispute, and yet she found herself wondering how many of these details had been directly observed, and how many had simply been repeated often enough to become accepted fact. Across the churchyard, Mrs. Crane was speaking with the vicar. Miss Marple watched as Colonel Bantry approached them, offering some remark that brought a slight smile to Mrs. Crane's composed features. The Colonel's wife joined them a moment later, and the four stood in easy conversation, the picture of village society functioning as it should. "She's been such a comfort to us all," Mrs. Hartnell announced, appearing at Miss Marple's elbow with the suddenness of one who has been waiting for an opportunity. "Poor Mrs. Crane, she gave up so much of her own time these past months. We were just saying, weren't we, Mrs. Price, that she's been absolutely devoted." "You were indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And never a word of complaint," Mrs. Hartnell continued, warming to her theme. "Not like some people who make such a fuss about their charitable work. Mrs. Crane simply did what needed doing, without any thought for herself. That's true goodness, in my opinion." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Had you visited Mr. Hargreaves yourself during his illness?" Mrs. Hartnell looked momentarily disconcerted. "Well, no. That is, Mrs. Crane had things so well in hand there seemed no need. And Mr. Hargreaves was never one to welcome a crowd. But Mrs. Crane kept us informed. She made sure we knew he was comfortable and lacking nothing." "How thoughtful of her," Miss Marple said. The group around Mrs. Crane had shifted. The vicar had moved away to speak with Mr. Petherick, leaving Mrs. Crane with the Bantrys. Miss Marple noticed that while they spoke to her with every appearance of warmth, there was something rehearsed about the exchange, as though they were all following lines from a script they had previously agreed upon. Young Dr. Metcalfe approached Miss Marple with the slightly harried air of a man who had fulfilled one duty and was already calculating the demands of the next. "A sad business, Miss Marple," he said, accepting tea from Mrs. Price. "Though as peaceful an end as one could hope for. The heart simply gave out. Not unexpected at his age. You'd been attending him regularly? These last few weeks, yes, though Mrs. Crane managed most of his care admirably and very capable, followed my instructions to the letter and kept excellent notes on his condition." He paused, taking a sip of tea. "In fact, she was better at noting the daily changes than I might have been myself. Very observant, very thorough." "She has medical training, perhaps?" Miss Marple inquired. "I don't believe so, just natural competence and genuine concern. She made my job considerably easier, I can tell you. Some relatives can be quite difficult, always questioning every decision." But Mrs. Crane understood that Mr. Hargreaves needed rest and quiet, and she made sure he had both. Miss Marple absorbed this with a thoughtful nod. She was a relative, then? Dr. Metcalfe looked briefly uncertain. "Well, no, not by blood. But she had known him for some years, I understand, and when there's no family to speak of, a trusted friend serves just as well. Better, sometimes." He excused himself shortly after, leaving Miss Marple to contemplate the curious fact that Mrs. Crane seemed to occupy a position of assumed intimacy with Mr. Hargreaves that no one could quite define, but everyone appeared to accept without question. The gathering began to disperse. Miss Marple watched as Mrs. Crane made her way toward the gate, pausing to exchange a few words with various villagers. Each conversation followed the same pattern: expressions of sympathy toward Mrs. Crane, acknowledgments of her dedication, assurances that she had done everything possible. What no one asked, Miss Marple noticed, was how Mrs. Crane had come to assume such complete responsibility for a man who had spent most of his life carefully maintaining his distance from village intimacy. She caught Mrs. Crane's eye across the churchyard and offered a small nod of acknowledgement. Mrs. Crane returned it with a slight smile, polite, controlled, giving away nothing. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat in her morning room considering the day's observations. She had attended many funerals over her long life, and she had learned to distinguish between genuine mourning and theatrical display, between private grief and public performance. What she had witnessed today was neither of these familiar patterns. Instead, she had seen a village united in approval of Mrs. Crane's conduct, approval of Mr. Hargreaves's peaceful end, approval of an arrangement that had concluded exactly as everyone seemed to believe it should. But approval, Miss Marple reflected, was a curious emotion to detect at a funeral. Sympathy? Yes. Sorrow? Certainly. Relief, sometimes, when death ended suffering. But this collective approval suggested something else entirely. Satisfaction that events had proceeded according to a proper plan. She thought of how often Mrs. Crane's name had been mentioned, and how little anyone had actually said about her, beyond general praise. She thought of the way people spoke for Mrs. Crane, explaining her devotion and her sacrifices, her competence, without appearing to have asked Mrs. Crane herself. It reminded Miss Marple of a village production she had once witnessed, where the lead actress had been taken ill and an understudy had stepped into the role. The other actors had been so determined to make the performance succeed that they had begun speaking the absent actress's lines for her, filling in her parts, smoothing over her uncertainties. The result had been technically correct, but fundamentally false. A performance about a performance rather than the play itself. She wondered if something similar had happened with Mrs. Crane. Had the village become so invested in the story of her devoted care that they had stopped noticing the woman herself and seen only the role she was meant to fulfill? And if so, who had written that role? Who had decided what Mrs. Crane should be to Mr. Hargreaves and what he should be to her? Outside, the evening drew in with the promise of frost. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her fingers moving with their accustomed rhythm, while her mind followed threads of a different sort. Tomorrow she thought she might call on Mrs. Crane. A simple visit to express condolences, Nothing unusual in that. Nothing to make anyone uncomfortable. Just a quiet conversation between two women who had both lived long enough to understand that the truest things were often the ones left unsaid. And perhaps, if she listened carefully enough, she might hear what those unsaid things were trying to become. Chapter 3. A Letter Kept Too Carefully. Miss Marple's visit to Mrs. Crane was delayed by 2 days of persistent rain that turned the lanes to mud and made social calls impractical. During this interval, she had occasion to hear the letter mentioned 3 times, each reference coming unbidden in the course of ordinary conversation. The first mention came from Miss Hartwell at the draper's, where Miss Marple had gone to purchase embroidery silk. They had been discussing the usual run of village matters when Miss Hartwell remarked, quite casually, that Mr. Hargreaves had left everything very clear. "Mrs. Crane showed me the letter," she said, examining a bolt of cotton with unnecessary concentration. Or rather, she mentioned it. The one he wrote explaining his wishes. Very thoughtful of him, really. To put things in writing. Miss Marple selected a skein of pale green thread. I'm sure that must have been a comfort to her. Oh yes, tremendous. Everything. You see why he wanted her to manage his affairs, why he trusted her judgment. All very straightforward. Miss Hartwell paused, then added with a small laugh, though I confess I didn't actually read it myself. Mrs. Crane simply told me what it said, but one could see it had given her great peace of mind. The second reference occurred the following afternoon, when the rain had eased to drizzle, and Miss Marple encountered Mr. Petherick leaving the post office. The solicitor was a man who measured his words as carefully as he measured property boundaries, which made his volunteered information all the more noteworthy. I understand you are well acquainted with Mr. Hargreaves, Miss Marple ventured, adjusting her umbrella against the damp breeze. In a professional capacity, yes, Mr. Petherick replied. He was most particular about his testamentary arrangements. Everything properly documented, witnessed, filed, a methodical mind. Mrs. Crane mentioned a letter, I believe, Miss Marple said, the small fabrication slipping out with the ease born of long practice in gentle investigation. Mr. Petherick's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Ah, yes, the letter. Mrs. Crane did reference it when we discussed the estate. A personal communication, not part of the formal will, but explaining Mr. Hargreaves's intentions regarding his final arrangements. He was quite specific about wanting her to handle certain matters. You've seen it, then? Mrs. Crane described its contents to me, Mr. Petherick said, with the precision of one choosing words that were technically accurate. It clarified several points that might otherwise have seemed unusual, the extent of her access to his household, for instance, and his desire for privacy during his final illness, all perfectly reasonable when one understood his reasoning. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. It was interesting, she reflected, how the letter seemed to explain everything while being seen by no one. The third mention came from Mrs. Hartnell, who called on Miss Marple that evening with a jar of marmalade and a need to discuss village affairs. The rain had stopped, leaving behind that particular stillness that follows wet weather, and they sat in Miss Marple's morning room watching the last light fade from a pewter sky. I've been thinking about poor Mr. Hargreaves, Mrs. Hartnell announced, settling into her chair with the decisiveness of one who has reached conclusions. And really, when one considers the letter, everything makes perfect sense. Miss Marple looked up from pouring tea. The letter. The one he wrote to Mrs. Crane, explaining why he'd chosen her, of all people, to be so intimately involved in his care. Apparently it was quite moving, full of gratitude for past kindnesses and trust in her character. Mrs. Hartnell accepted her cup with a satisfied air. Mrs. Crane was very touched by it, naturally. She told the vicar it had made everything clear to her, all his wishes and preferences. Such a relief to have things spelled out, don't you think? Indeed, Miss Marple murmured, though I wonder... The vicar said it explained everything about their arrangement, Mrs. Hartnell continued, riding over the interruption with enthusiasm. Why Mr. Hargreaves wanted no other visitors toward the end, why he'd given Mrs. Crane such complete authority over his household. All there in the letter, apparently. Most considerate of him to make his feelings so plain. Miss Marple sipped her tea, noting that the letter, according to Mrs. Hartnell, had been described by Mrs. Crane to the vicar, who had then conveyed its significance to the village. A curious chain of testimony for a document meant to clarify matters directly. After Mrs. Hartnell departed, Miss Marple sat for some time in the gathering darkness, thinking about letters and what they revealed by existing only in description. In her experience, genuine letters, the sort written with honest intent, were usually produced when needed. They were folded and unfolded until the creases grew soft, passed from hand to hand, referenced by direct quotation. Their physical presence lent weight to their contents. Letters that explained everything while being seen by no one were a different species entirely. They existed in the manner of ghosts, spoken of, believed in, given substance, through repeated assertion rather than evidence. What troubled Miss Marple was not that the letter remained private. There could be many legitimate reasons for Mrs. Crane to keep her personal communication to herself. What troubled her was the slight variations in the descriptions. Miss Hartwell had spoken of it, explaining Mr. Hargreaves's wishes regarding Mrs. Crane's management of his affairs. Mr. Petherick had referenced specific intentions about final arrangements and privacy. Mrs. Hartnell had described expressions of gratitude and detailed preferences. Each version was plausible. Each served to justify Mrs. Crane's intimate involvement in Mr. Hargreaves's final months, but they did not quite describe the same letter. Miss Marple rose and went to her escritoire, where she kept her own correspondence carefully organised in compartmented drawers. She withdrew an old letter from a nephew written years ago, and reread it with attention to detail. The words were fixed. They said what they said, no more and no less. One could misremember the phrasing, perhaps, or recall the sentiment imperfectly, but the essential contents did not shift with each retelling. The letter about Mr. Hargreaves, it seemed, possessed a more flexible nature. She returned the nephew's letter to its proper place and stood for a moment, one hand resting on the polished wood of the escritoire. In her long life, she had observed that people often wrote letters to accomplish one of two purposes: to communicate what they felt unable to say aloud, or to create a record of what they wished to be believed. Mr. Hargreaves's letter, if it existed in the form described, appeared to have served the latter purpose admirably. It had explained everything. It had justified an unusual arrangement. It had silenced question before they could be properly formed. But Miss Marple had learned over many years of quiet observation that explanations offered too readily were often the ones most in need of examination. And letters kept too carefully sometimes functioned less as communications than as permissions. Permissions to accept a convenient story without looking too closely at the pages beneath. She thought again of visiting Mrs. Crane, a simple condolence call, nothing more, but perhaps, in the course of natural conversation, the letter might be mentioned, and perhaps Mrs. Crane might be invited to describe it in her own words, without the intervening translations of Miss Hartwell, Mr. Petherick, and the vicar. Sometimes, Miss Marple reflected, returning to her chair by the window, the most illuminating discoveries came. Not from what was said, but from noting how many different ways the same thing could be described by people who had never actually seen it. And if a letter could be so many things to so many people while remaining unseen by all, one had to wonder whether its greatest service was not in what it contained, but in what its existence allowed people to believe without the inconvenience of proof. Outside, the evening had settled into night. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her thoughts as methodical as the movement of her needles. Tomorrow, she decided, tomorrow she would call on Mrs. Crane, and perhaps she would ask, very gently, about that remarkably useful letter. Chapter 4, The Weight of an Unasked Question. Miss Marple's visit to Mrs. Crane was postponed once more, this time by the arrival of her great-nephew Raymond, who appeared unexpectedly from London with a pulled muscle and a need for country recuperation. By the time she had settled him with books and hot water bottles, and assured herself that his discomfort was temporary rather than serious, 3 days had passed. It was during Raymond's convalescence that Miss Marple found herself thinking more deeply about Mr. Hargreaves' earlier life. Not the quiet, reclusive existence the village had known, but the years before he had settled in St. Mary Mead. The prompt came from Raymond himself, who had been reading the newspaper and remarked on an obituary for a former military officer. "Funny how these war chaps all seem to know each other," he observed from his position on the sofa. "Half the obituary is about other fellows he served with, like a closed club." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "Mr. Hargreaves was in the war, I believe." "Which one?" Raymond had asked, with the casual indifference of youth to which war one meant. "The first," Miss Marple said, "though he never spoke of it, as far as I know." That afternoon, after Raymond had been persuaded to nap, Miss Marple found herself in the company of Colonel Bantry, who had stopped by to return a book borrowed weeks earlier. They spoke of Raymond's visit, of the garden's slow emergence from winter, and then, as conversations do when guided by patient hands, of Mr. Hargreaves. "Did you know him well, Colonel?" Miss Marple inquired, offering the tea. Colonel Bantry considered this. "Can't say I did, really. Cordial enough when we met, but not a man for clubs or company. Dolly used to invite him to dinner occasionally, felt he shouldn't be quite so isolated, but he always declined, very politely, mind you, but firmly. He had lived here many years, I think. Since the late 20s, I believe. Came down from somewhere north, Yorkshire, perhaps, or Durham. Bought the cottage outright, no mortgage. Army pension and some private income, I gathered, though he lived simply enough." Miss Marple poured tea with careful attention. "Had he family elsewhere?" "None that I ever heard mentioned. Seemed to be quite alone in the world." The Colonel accepted his cup. Dolly once said she thought there might have been some sadness in his past. A broken engagement, perhaps, or a falling out with relatives, but that was pure speculation on her part. Mr. Hargreaves never confided anything of the sort. After the Colonel departed, Miss Marple sat with this information, turning it over as one might examine a stone found on a familiar path, something that had always been there but only now seemed worth closer attention. A man alone, with no family, no close friends, living quietly on the edge of a village for more than 20 years. Not unhappy necessarily, but not seeking connection either. It suggested either natural reclusiveness or deliberate withdrawal, the distinction Miss Marple thought mattered. The following morning brought clearer weather and a chance encounter with Mrs. Price outside the chemist's. They spoke of Raymond's improving health, of the price of lamb, and then Mrs. Price said something that caught Miss Marple's attention. "I was just remembering Mr. Hargreaves the other day," she remarked, adjusting her shopping basket. "My late husband once mentioned him, years ago. They'd had some conversation about Durham. My husband's mother came from there, you see. He said Mr. Hargreaves seemed quite moved to speak of it, as though it reminded him of something he'd rather not recall." "Did your husband know what that might have been?" Mrs. Price shook her head. "He never said, and I never thought to ask. You know how men are about other men's private sorrows. They acknowledge them with a nod and move on." She paused. "Though I do remember him saying that Mr. Hargreaves had mentioned a friend once, someone from his army days. Spoke of him with great respect, apparently, but then changed the subject rather abruptly, as though he'd said more than he intended." Miss Marple absorbed this quietly. A friend from army days, mentioned once and never again. It might mean nothing, it might mean everything. That evening she mentioned the conversation to Raymond, who'd recovered sufficiently to take an interest in village matters. "Sounds like he'd quarrelled with someone," Raymond suggested, with the confident analysis of someone who had never lived long enough to understand how silence could be more complex than argument. "Probably over something stupid, who was braver, or who got promoted first. War friendships often go that way, I'm told. Too intense to last once real life resumes." Miss Marple made a non-committal sound. Quarrels, in her experience, were rarely mentioned, only once and never again. Quarrels festered. They required rehearsal, justification, the repeated assertion of one's rightness. What Raymond described sounded less like a quarrel than a door quietly closed. The next piece came from an unexpected source. Miss Hartwell, who was given to sudden recollections prompted by seemingly unrelated topics. She had been discussing the church's flower arrangements when she suddenly remarked, "You know, I just remembered something about Mr. Hargreaves. It must have been 10 years ago, perhaps more. The vicar at the time asked him to serve on the committee for the War Memorial restoration. Mr. Hargreaves refused." "Did he give a reason?" "He said he didn't feel qualified to speak for those who had served." Miss Hartwell's brow furrowed, which seemed odd given that he had served himself, but he was quite definite about it. The vicar said afterward that Mr. Hargreaves had looked quite distressed, though he'd kept his voice perfectly level. Miss Marple thought about this. A man who had served refusing to speak for those who had served. Not because he lacked experience, but because he felt unqualified. The phrasing suggested not modesty, but judgment. Judgment, perhaps, of himself. She began to see the outline of something taking shape. A friendship broken. A responsibility set aside. A decision made during wartime that had never been revisited. And beneath it all, a man who had lived quietly on the margins of village life for 20 years, never seeking absolution because he had never articulated the sin. Or perhaps because some things, once done, existed beyond the reach of absolution. The difficulty, Miss Marple reflected as she prepared for bed that evening, was that no one admitted to knowing the whole story. The Colonel knew of isolation but not its cause. Mrs. Price's husband had heard of a friend, unnamed and unelaborated. Miss Hartwell had witnessed refusal but not understood its source. Each person held a fragment, and none had thought to ask the questions that might have assembled those fragments into meaning. But then Miss Marple thought that was often how villages managed uncomfortable truths, by accepting stedsan as agreement, by treating privacy as virtue, by never quite asking the questions whose answers might require them to see their neighbours differently. Mr. Hargreaves had lived among them for more than 20 years, and they had let him remain a stranger because it was easier than knowing him. Now he was dead, and the questions that had never been asked seemed suddenly heavier for their absence. Miss Marple extinguished her bedside lamp and settled into the darkness. Tomorrow, she thought again, she would visit Mrs. Crane, but now she would go with different questions, not about a letter, but about the man who had supposedly written it, and about what Mrs. Crane might have known that the village had chosen not to ask. Chapter 5, Stories That Explained Enough. Raymond departed on Saturday morning considerably improved and bearing a jar of Miss Marple's quince jelly for his mother. His visit had been brief but useful in ways he could not have imagined, having provided both the occasion for delayed action and the stimulus for clearer thought. Miss Marple spent the afternoon considering how best to approach Mrs. Crane. One could not simply appear on a doorstep and begin asking penetrating questions about a dead man's past. There were forms to be observed, courtesies to be maintained, but by Sunday, Providence intervened in the form of Mrs. Bantry, who mentioned after church that she intended to call on Mrs. Crane that very afternoon. "Poor woman has been quite alone since the funeral," Mrs. Bantry observed, drawing on her gloves. "I thought I'd bring her some cuttings from the conservatory. Would you care to accompany me, Miss Marple? I'm sure she'd welcome the company." Miss Marple accepted quiet gratitude. Sometimes, she reflected, the best investigations were those conducted in the company of someone who had no idea they were investigating anything at all. Mrs. Crane's house stood on Lambton Road, a tidy brick villa with a small front garden showing early signs of spring cultivation. She received them with composed hospitality, settling them in a sitting room that was comfortable without being personal, the sort of room that suggested its occupant had achieved contentment through tasteful restraint, rather than passionate accumulation. Mrs. Bantry presented her cuttings and made the appropriate remarks about solitude and time for reflection. Mrs. Crane accepted both with grace that seemed entirely genuine. "You're very kind," she said, arranging the cuttings in a vase with efficient movements. "Though I confess I haven't felt particularly alone. Mr. Hargreaves's affairs have kept me occupied, sorting through papers, corresponding with his bank, that sort of thing. It's been rather a comfort, actually, having practical matters to attend to." "I'm sure it must be a relief to know you've fulfilled his wishes so completely," Mrs. Bantry said warmly. "The whole village has remarked on your devotion." Something flickered across Mrs. Crane's face. Not quite discomfort, but something adjacent to it. "I did what needed doing," she said simply. "Mr. Hargreaves made it very clear what he required, and I was able to provide it." Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing the room's modest furnishings, spoke for the first time. It must have been quite a responsibility, taking on his care so completely. "It was manageable," Mrs. Crane replied, her tone measured. "He was not a demanding patient. Toward the end he wanted only quiet and privacy. No fuss, no unnecessary visitors. I respected that." "Had he always been so reclusive?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Mrs. Crane paused in her arrangement of the cuttings. "I believe he valued solitude, yes. Some people find peace in company. Others find it in withdrawal. Mr. Hargreaves belonged to the latter category." It was a reasonable explanation, sufficient in its way, yet Miss Marple noticed that it explained Mr. Hargreaves's nature without explaining how Mrs. Crane had come to understand it so intimately. Mrs. Bantry, oblivious to undercurrents, continued with her customary kindness. "Still, it must have been gratifying to know he trusted you so completely. The vicar mentioned that Mr. Hargreaves had written you a letter explaining his wishes. How thoughtful of him to make everything so clear." Mrs. Crane's hands stilled. "Mr. Hargreaves was a thoughtful man," she agreed, her voice carefully neutral. "It must have been quite detailed." Mrs. Bantry pressed on, meaning only to be sympathetic. "To cover all the arrangements for his final months." It clarified matters, certainly. Mrs. Crane resumed her work with the flowers, her movements perhaps a shade more deliberate than before. Mr. Hargreaves was precise in his communications. He left no room for doubt about his preferences. Miss Marple observed that this, like everything else Mrs. Crane had said, was perfectly true while revealing nothing. It was the verbal equivalent of the room they sat in, tasteful, composed, and withholding. After they departed, Mrs. Bantry remarked on what a dignified woman Mrs. Crane was. "So self-possessed, don't you think? Not making a display of her grief. I do admire that sort of restraint." Miss Marple murmured agreement, though her thoughts were following a different track. Self-possession, she reflected, could spring from many sources. Sometimes it arose from genuine composure, sometimes from long practice at presenting an acceptable surface to the world. The following days brought more stories, or rather variations on the same story, each told with slight differences that nonetheless arrived at the same conclusion. At the baker's, Mrs. Price mentioned that Dr. Metcalf had said Mr. Hargreaves seemed ready to go, that he had spoken of being tired and wanting rest. A natural resignation, she called it, as though death were an appointment that one simply kept when the time seemed right. Miss Hartwell, encountered at the library, had heard from the vicar that Mr. Hargreaves had put his spiritual affairs in order weeks before his passing. "Complete acceptance of mortality," she said approvingly. "Such wisdom in the elderly." Even young Dr. Metcalf, when Miss Marple met him on the lane, offered his assessment with professional certainty. "The body simply wore out, Miss Marple. One sees it often enough. The heart loses its vigour, the lungs their capacity, and the patient gradually withdraws. Mr. Hargreaves followed that pattern exactly. Textbook, really. Each explanation was medically sound, spiritually appropriate, emotionally satisfying. Each described a peaceful decline, properly managed, resulting in an expected end. Together they formed a narrative that required no further examination. But Miss Marple, listening to these accounts with her characteristic patience, noticed what they all shared beyond their reassuring content. They all stopped at explanation. None invited inquiry into what had preceded the decline, what had shaped the man who accepted death so readily, what might have made solitude preferable to society. Villages, she had observed over many years, possessed a remarkable capacity for agreement on narratives that preserved their comfort. A man died peacefully in his sleep, attended by a devoted friend having arranged his affairs with admirable foresight. What more needed to be said? The truth, of course. But truth had a way of being unwelcome when it threatened to complicate satisfactory conclusions. Miss Marple thought again of Mr. Hargreaves's refusal to serve on the War Memorial Committee, of the friend mentioned once and never again, of 20 years lived quietly on the margins of village life. She thought of Mrs. Crane's careful answers that revealed nothing while seeming to reveal everything. And she thought of how readily people accepted explanations that spared them the discomfort of deeper questions. Fatigue, resignation, acceptance, natural decline. All true, perhaps, all sufficient, all stopping precisely where understanding might have begun. That evening Miss Marple sat in her accustomed chair, her knitting growing steadily as her thoughts moved in their own measured pattern. She had learned, over a lifetime of observation, that villages constructed their narratives as carefully as they constructed their buildings, with an eye to harmony, proportion, and the preservation of established views. Mr. Hargreaves had been reclusive by nature. Mrs. Crane had been devoted in her care. His death had been peaceful and expected. These were the agreed-upon facts, repeated until they achieved the weight of truth through sheer consistency. But facts, Miss Marple knew, were only the beginning of truth. Between the fact of a man's death and the truth of his life lay all the questions no one had thought to ask, or had chosen not to ask because the answers might require them to see both the dead and the living with uncomfortable clarity. She set down her knitting and gazed into the fire. Tomorrow, she decided, she would visit Mr. Hargreaves's cottage. It stood empty now, awaiting settlement of the estate. A quiet walk past it would be entirely natural, part of her customary route, requiring no explanation. And if she happened to notice something that others had missed, well, that was simply what came of paying attention to details that seemed too small to matter. Until, of course, they mattered very much indeed. Chapter 6. The Protection of Old Mistakes. Miss Marple's walk took her past Mr. Hargreaves's cottage on Tuesday afternoon, when the light held that peculiar clarity that comes before spring rain. The stone building stood silent behind its low wall, curtains drawn, the small garden already showing signs of neglect in the way gardens do when their keeper's hand is removed. She had not intended to linger, but the gate stood slightly ajar, not broken, merely unlatched, and it seemed natural enough to close it properly. From the gate, it was a short step to the front door, and from there her eyes were drawn to the windowsill where several letters lay visible through the glass, presumably delivered after Mr. Hargreaves's death and pushed through the letter slot. There was nothing remarkable in this observation, nothing that required action. Yet Miss Marple found herself thinking of those letters lying uncollected, and of the letter that had been so frequently mentioned but never seen, and of how written words could accumulate layers of meaning through absence as readily as through presence. She was still standing there, lost in thought, when Mr. Petherick appeared around the corner, briefcase in hand, an expression mildly startled. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect to encounter anyone here." "I was simply passing," she said truthfully, "and noticed the gate. One doesn't like to see things left untidy." Mr. Petherick's expression softened. "Quite right. The estate is in probate, of course, but these small matters of maintenance do slip through." He paused, then added, "I was just collecting some documents. Legal formalities." "Of course." Miss Marple hesitated, then ventured, "It must be a complex business, settling an estate when there are no family members to consult." "Actually, it's remarkably straightforward." Mr. Petherick adjusted his spectacles with the precision of long habit. "Mr. Hargreaves was meticulous in his planning, every set anticipated, every contingency addressed. The will is quite clear, small bequest to various charities, the cottage to be sold with proceeds distributed according to his specifications. Mrs. Crane receives a modest sum in recognition of her assistance. All very proper and carefully considered. How fortunate that he had someone like Mrs. Crane to help him arrange everything." Something shifted in Mr. Petherick's expression, not discomfort exactly, but a subtle recalibration of professional discretion. "Indeed, though I should clarify that the will itself was drawn up several years ago, long before Mrs. Crane entered the picture. The arrangements regarding his final care were added later, through codicils and separate instruction, but the fundamental structure remained unchanged. Miss Marple absorbed this quietly. So Mrs. Crane's involvement was relatively recent. 5 years, perhaps 6, Mr. Hargreaves lived in St. Mary Mead for more than 20 without requiring assistance from anyone. Mr. Petherick glanced at the cottage, his tone thoughtful. A very self-sufficient man, until he wasn't. It was an odd way to phrase it, Miss Marple thought. Not until he couldn't be, but until he wasn't, as though self-sufficiency had been a choice that Mr. Hargreaves had eventually decided to relinquish. After Mr. Petherick departed, Miss Marple walked slowly back toward the village proper, her mind working through what she had learned. A man who had lived independently for decades, then suddenly accepting help. A will made years before Mrs. Crane's arrival, then modified to accommodate her presence, an arrangement that appeared both recent and carefully planned. The church clock was striking 4 when she encountered Mrs. Bantry near the post office, flushed with news. "I've just had the most interesting conversation with old Mrs. Kimball," Mrs. Bantry announced. "You know she's been in St. Mary Mead since before the war, the Great War, I mean. I happened to mention Mr. Hargreaves, and she remembered something rather curious." Miss Marple waited with the patience of one who knew that Mrs. Bantry's stories, however circuitously delivered, generally arrived at something worth hearing. She said that when Mr. Hargreaves first came to the village, this would have been 1928 or thereabouts, someone visited him, a woman, middle-aged, very respectable. Mrs. Kimball noticed because the woman stayed at the inn for 3 days and there was some sort of disagreement between them. Nothing public, you understand, but she saw them walking together near the churchyard, and there was something about their manner that suggested matters unresolved. Did Mrs. Kimball know who the woman was? She never learned her name. The woman left quite suddenly, and Mr. Hargreaves never mentioned her. But Mrs. Kimball said, and this is the curious part, that Mr. Hargreaves seemed relieved after she'd gone, but also somehow diminished, as though he had won an argument but lost something more important in the winning. Miss Marple considered this addition to the slowly accumulating portrait of Mr. Hargreaves, a man who came to St. Mary Mead from the north, carrying some burden from his past, a woman who followed him, argued with him, and left without reconciliation. 20 years of self-imposed isolation. Then, in his final years, the acceptance of help from Mrs. Crane. That evening she received an unexpected visitor. The vicar, Mr. Clement, appeared at her door with an apologetic air and a question that had, he said, been troubling him. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, Miss Marple, but you have such a clear way of seeing things, and I find myself somewhat confused about a pastoral matter." They settled in the morning room, and Mr. Clement explained with several false starts that he had been thinking about Mr. Hargreaves and wondering whether he had failed in some duty of care. He was so determined to keep his distance, the vicar said. "I tried early on to draw him into the life of the parish, but he would accept no role, no responsibility. He attended services but avoided fellowship, and I confess I eventually stopped trying. He looked genuinely distressed. Should I have persisted? Should I have pressed him to share whatever burden he was carrying?" "Did you believe he was carrying a burden?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Felt he was protecting something, or protecting someone from something?" Mr. Clement's hands moved restlessly. "A few months before his death, he asked to speak with me. I thought perhaps he wished to unburden himself at last, but when we met, he spoke only of arrangements, his funeral preferences, that sort of thing, and then he said something that has stayed with me." "What did he say?" "He said, 'I have lived my life in such a way that certain people may continue to respect certain memories. I should like to die without disturbing that arrangement.' I asked what he meant, and he simply smiled and said it wasn't important." Mr. Clement paused. "But it was important, Miss Marple. I could see it in his eyes. He was protecting something even in death." After the vicar left, Miss Marple sat for a long time in the gathering dusk. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, though she could not yet see its full shape. Mr. Hargreaves had made a choice during or after the war, a choice involving a friend, a woman, perhaps a responsibility abandoned or a trust betrayed. He had lived with that choice for more than 20 years, not seeking forgiveness because forgiveness would require disclosure, and disclosure would disturb the respectability of others who had built their lives upon his silence. He had protected the past not because it was shameful to him alone, but because its revelation would disappoint people who had depended on it remaining hidden. And Mrs. Crane, where did she fit into this carefully maintained silence? Miss Marple thought of the woman who had visited in 1928, middle-aged and respectable, arguing with Mr. Hargreaves near the churchyard. She thought of Mrs. Crane, who had appeared 5 or 6 years ago and gradually assumed complete authority over Mr. Hargreaves's final days. She thought of how Mr. Hargreaves had feared disclosure more than death, and she began to understand that sometimes the greatest kindness people offer each other is not forgiveness, but the agreement to leave certain questions unasked, until circumstances make that agreement impossible to maintain. Outside, the rain that had been threatening all afternoon began to fall soft and steady. Miss Marple rose to close the window, her reflection ghostly in the darkening glass. Tomorrow, she thought, she would need to speak with Mrs. Crane again. Not about letters or final arrangements, but about the past that Mr. Hargreaves had worked so hard to protect, and about whether his death had truly been as natural as everyone preferred to believe. Chapter 7. A Promise Made Out of Season. Miss Marple's second visit to Mrs. Crane was undertaken alone, on a morning when the spring sunshine carried more promise than warmth. She had given considerable thought to her approach and had decided that directness tempered with compassion would serve better than elaborate pretense. Mrs. Crane received her without surprise, which was itself interesting. It suggested she had been expecting something of this nature, not necessarily a visit from Miss Marple specifically, but a moment when the careful surface of recent weeks might be disturbed by a more probing inquiry. They sat in the same comfortable room as before, but this time Miss Marple did not wait for social pleasantries to establish their rhythm. "Mrs. Crane," she said gently, "I wonder if you would tell me about the woman who visited Mr. Hargreaves in 1928. The silence that followed was not hostile, merely considering. Mrs. Crane's hands, folded neatly in her lap, remained perfectly still. "You've been making inquiries," she said at last. It was not an accusation, simply an observation. "I've been listening," Miss Marple corrected. "Villagers remember more than one might expect, though they don't always understand what they remember." Mrs. Crane rose and went to the window, looking out at her orderly garden. When she spoke, her voice held a quality Miss Marple had not heard before. Not quite resignation, but something like relief at no longer having to maintain a particular pretense. "The woman was my mother," she said. "She travelled to St. Mary Mead to speak with Mr. Hargreaves about a matter that concerned our family. The conversation did not go as she had hoped. A matter from the war. From during the war, yes, though its consequences extended well beyond the armistice." Mrs. Crane turned back to face Miss Marple. "My father and Mr. Hargreaves served together in France. They were close friends, the sort of friendship that forms under extraordinary circumstances and seems as though it should last forever." She returned to her chair, her movements controlled but no longer quite so composed. "There was an incident," she continued, "a decision that had to be made quickly, under difficult conditions. My father made one choice. Mr. Hargreaves disagreed with it, felt it was dishonourable, though he could not prevent it. After the war, they parted ways. My father built a respectable life in Durham, married my mother, became a schoolmaster, earned the regard of his community." "And Mr. Hargreaves?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "He left Durham and never returned. Never spoke of my father again, according to what my mother learned. She discovered this when my father died in 1927. Among his papers was a letter he had written to Mr. Hargreaves years earlier, attempting to explain or justify his actions. It had never been sent, but it contained Mr. Hargreaves's last known address." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Your mother wished to understand what had happened between them. More than that, she wished to defend my father's memory. She had spent years believing him to be a man of complete integrity, and the unsent letter suggested otherwise. She needed to know whether Mr. Hargreaves held knowledge that would tarnish that carefully constructed respectability. And what did Mr. Hargreaves tell her? Mrs. Crane's expression softened slightly, taking on a complexity that suggested old pain examined from sufficient distance to bear it. He told her nothing, or rather, he told her that the past was settled, that my father had lived the life he chose, and that further discussion would serve no one's interest. My mother understood this to mean that Mr. Hargreaves would keep whatever he knew to himself provided she did the same. She returned to Durham. The matter was closed. But not forgotten? No, not forgotten. Mrs. Crane's voice grew quieter. My mother died 5 years ago. Before her death, she told me everything she had learned and suspected, and she expressed regret that she had never thanked Mr. Hargreaves properly for his silence, a silence that had protected not just my father's reputation, but our entire family's standing in a community that valued respectability above nearly everything else. Miss Marple began to see the shape of what had followed. And so you came to St. Mary Mead. I came to offer gratitude that my mother had not been able to express. I thought perhaps a simple acknowledgement, a thank you for protecting a family he had no reason to protect. Mrs. Crane's hands finally moved, gesturing slightly. Mr. Hargreaves was elderly when I arrived, still independent, still guarded, but he recognized my name immediately. He knew why I'd come. How did he respond? With caution at first, then gradually with something like relief. I think he had carried his knowledge alone for so long that having someone who understood, even though partially, was a comfort he had not anticipated. She paused. We did not speak of it dearly, not for some time, but we developed an understanding. I would visit occasionally, help with small errands, nothing intrusive, just presence. Miss Marple listened with the attention she brought to all revelations of human complexity, and when he became ill, he asked if I would attend to his final arrangements. He had no one else, you see, no family, no close friends, just an elderly woman who represented a past he had protected at considerable cost to his own peace of mind. Mrs. Crane's voice carried a tremor she could not quite suppress. I agreed because I felt it was the least I could do. My family had benefited from his silence for decades. Surely, I could offer him companionship in his final months. The morning light had shifted, casting new shadows across the room. Miss Marple considered the pattern that had emerged. A young man's wartime choice, a friend's disapproval, decades of separation maintained to preserve reputations built on silence, and then, in the final chapter of life, a daughter's gratitude transforming into something more complicated. You cared for him very well, Miss Marple said carefully. Everyone has remarked upon it. I tried to do what he needed. Mrs. Crane's tone had regained some of its earlier composure, but underneath ran a current of something Miss Marple could not quite identify. He was very specific about his preferences. No visitors towards the end, no disturbances. He wanted things to conclude quietly without complications. And the letter that everyone mentions? The one explaining his wishes? Mrs. Crane met Miss Marple's eyes directly. There was a letter. Mr. Hargreaves wrote it several months before his death, outlining his final wishes and explaining why he wanted me to manage his care. It exists exactly as people have described it. But what people understand from it is not quite the whole of what it contains. Mrs. Crane's voice was steady, but Miss Marple detected the weight of words chosen with extreme care. Mr. Hargreaves wrote it to protect me, you see, to ensure that no one would question my authority or my decisions regarding his final days. He wanted everything to appear entirely natural and proper. Miss Marple felt the small shift that marked the moment when observation became understanding. He was giving you permission. He was asking me to help him, Mrs. Crane corrected softly. To help him conclude matters in a way that would disturb no one's peace, including his own. He had protected my family's respectability for decades. In his final weeks, he asked if I would be willing to protect his choice about how and when his life should end. The words hung in the air between them, neither quite spoken nor quite unspoken. Miss Marple sat very still, her hands quiet on her knitting bag. She thought of Mr. Hargreaves's careful planning, of his determination to have no visitors, of his specific trust in Mrs. Crane. She thought of how everyone had praised the peacefulness of his passing, how natural it had all seemed, and she thought of how her daughter's gratitude, meeting an old man's weariness, might have arrived at an arrangement that seemed to both parties like justice of a kind. A final balancing of old debts, paid not in confession but in release. "I see," she said at last, and meant it in all its complexity. Mrs. Crane looked at her steadily. "Do you?" "I believe I do," Miss Marple replied, "though I wonder if Mr. Hargreaves understood the position he was placing you in." "He understood perfectly," Mrs. Crane said. "That was why he wrote the letter, to protect me from exactly this moment, when someone might ask questions that required uncomfortable answers. Outside, a bird sang with the particular enthusiasm of early spring. Inside, two women sat in silence, each contemplating the weight of choices made out of season with the past, choices that seemed right at the time, but cast long shadows into futures no one could fully anticipate. Miss Marple rose to leave. At the door she paused. "Mrs. Crane, did Mr. Hargreaves ever tell you what your father had done? The choice that ended their friendship?" Mrs. Crane shook her head. "He said some silences should remain unbroken, that knowing would serve no purpose now." "Perhaps he was right," Miss Marple said gently. "Perhaps," Mrs. Crane agreed, "though I wonder sometimes whether the protection of old mistakes doesn't simply create the need for new ones." Chapter 8. What was done for the right reasons. Miss Marple did not leave Mrs. Crane's house immediately. Instead, she accepted the offer of tea that Mrs. Crane had not quite made, but that seemed to hang in the air between them as a necessary pause before what still needed to be said. They sat again, the morning having progressed into that particular quality of late forenoon light that makes rooms seem both intimate and exposed. Mrs. Crane prepared the tea with movements that suggested habit providing comfort, when thought became too demanding. "You must understand," Mrs. Crane said, setting the cup before Miss Marple with careful precision, "that I did not come to St. Mary Mead with any intention beyond gratitude. What developed between Mr. Hargreaves and myself was not planned. It simply occurred." Miss Marple added milk to her tea. "These things often do. He was lonely, I think, though he would never have admitted it. All those years of protecting a silence that benefited people he would never see again. My father had been dead for nearly 30 years. My mother had passed. The community in Durham that had profited from Mr. Hargreaves's discretion had long since scattered or died, and yet he continued to carry the weight of it, as though the promise once made could never be unmade. Integrity, Miss Marple observed, can become its own form of imprisonment. Yes. Mrs. Crane's voice held quiet gratitude for the understanding. That is precisely what I came to see. He had built his life around a single act of protection, and it had cost him everything: friendship, family, connection. He had chosen honour over happiness, and had lived with that choice for so long that he could no longer imagine any alternative. She paused, sipping her own tea before continuing. "We talked, over the months, not about my father's specific transgression. He would never speak of that, but about choices made during wartime, about living with consequences, about the difference between what one owes to the living and what one owes to the dead. He had spent decades honouring his promise to remain silent. I think by the time I knew him, he was simply tired of it all." Miss Marple listened with the stillness that invited continuation. "When he fell ill last autumn, I increased my visits. Dr. Metcalfe prescribed medication for the pain, for the fatigue. Mr. Hargreaves took what was offered, but complained that it dulled his mind. He wanted, he said, to remain clear-headed to the end, to make his own decisions about his own conclusion." The phrasing was deliberate, Miss Marple noted, not about his death, but about his conclusion, as though life were a book one could choose to finish on one's own terms. He asked me quite directly if I would be willing to help him arrange matters so that he might die peacefully at a time of his choosing without burden to others or disturbance to the village's comfort. Mrs. Crane's hands had steadied, her voice gaining the clarity that comes from speaking truth long considered. He was not in unbearable pain. He was not suffering beyond endurance. He was simply ready to be done, and he wished to accomplish that with the same precision he had brought to everything else in his life. "And you agreed?" Miss Marple said quietly. "Not immediately. I thought about it for several weeks. I spoke with him repeatedly to ensure this was truly his settled wish and not some temporary despair. He was quite firm, quite rational. He said he had lived his life protecting others from uncomfortable truths. He wished to die in the same manner, quietly, peacefully, in a way that would trouble no one." "Sure." Mrs. Crane set down her cup with a small click of china on china. "He wrote the letter then, the one everyone has mentioned. It was to protect me, you see, to establish that I had his complete trust, his explicit permission to manage his care as I saw fit. He knew that questions might arise and he wished to forestall them. The letter was insurance, I suppose, against suspicion." "But you did not show it to anyone," Miss Marple observed. "No, because to show it would invite the very questions it was meant to prevent. Instead, I referred to it, described its general contents. People accepted what I told them because it confirmed what they wanted to believe, that Mr. Hargreaves had died peacefully, attended by a devoted friend, with all matters properly arranged." The clock on the mantel ticked its steady rhythm. Outside, someone passed by on the lane, their footsteps fading into the broader sounds of village life continuing its customary patterns. "Dr. Metcalfe had prescribed sleeping medication," Mrs. Crane continued, her voice remaining level. "Mr. Hargreaves had been taking it intermittently. He saved them over several weeks. I did not provide them, I did not suggest it, but when he told me what he had done, what he intended to do, I did not stop him. And on the night he chose, I sat with him. I held his hand, I made sure he was comfortable and calm, and I stayed with him until it was over." She looked directly at Miss Marple. "It was peaceful, genuinely peaceful. He simply went to sleep and did not wake. I called to Metcalfe in the morning as though I had arrived to find him passed away in the night, which was, in all essential facts, what had occurred. The doctor saw what he expected to see, an elderly man whose heart had finally given out. No one questioned it because there was nothing to question. Everything appeared exactly as one would expect." "Almost perfect," Miss Marple murmured. "Almost," Mrs. Crane agreed. "Perfect would have required no questions at all. But I suppose human nature makes perfection impossible. Someone always wonders, even when there is nothing to see." Miss Marple set down her own cup, considering not just what had been said, but how it had been said. Mrs. Crane spoke without evasion or theatricality. This was not confession, seeking absolution, but clarity offered to someone who had earned the right to hear it. "You believe you did the right thing," Miss Marple said. It was not quite a question. "I believe I did what Mr. Hargreaves asked of me with the same consideration he had shown my family decades earlier. He protected us when we needed protection. I granted him peace when he needed peace. There is a symmetry in that which feels, if not right, then at least balanced." "And you have no regrets?" Mrs. Crane's composure wavered for the first time. "I have many regrets, Miss Marple. I regret that he felt he had no other recourse. I regret that a man of such integrity found himself so isolated that death seemed preferable to continued living. I regret that I was the only person he felt he could trust with his final request." She paused. "But I do not regret honouring his wish to die with dignity, on his own terms, in his own time. That much at least seemed owed to him." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of what had been spoken settling around them like dust after a disturbance. Miss Marple thought of all the times she had encountered good intentions leading to questionable actions, of people who believed themselves to be acting with compassion when they were perhaps acting with something more complicated. She thought of how easily certainty could disguise itself as mercy, and how conviction could smooth over the small hesitations that might otherwise give one pause. "Mrs. Crane," she said at last, "I wonder if you have considered that Mr. Hargreaves's request placed you in an impossible position, that his final act of protection of you through that letter was also a burden he had no right to ask you to carry." Mrs. Crane's eyes glistened, but her voice remained steady. "Yes," she said simply, "I have considered that every day since his death." "And yet you would do it again." "I would do it again," Mrs. Crane confirmed. "Because the alternative, refusing him, leaving him to face his end alone and perhaps less peacefully, seemed worse than any burden I might carry afterward." Miss Marple nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of hearing what had been said and understanding its implications. Outside, the village continued its ordinary rhythms, unknowing and undisturbed. Inside, two women sat with the knowledge of what had truly occurred and with the question of what, if anything, should be done about it. Chapter 9. Miss Marple. Names the unease. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her mind occupied with considerations that had nothing to do with the pleasant spring afternoon or the early crocuses now blooming determinedly in cottage gardens. She had heard Mrs. Crane's account. She had understood its reasoning, and now she faced the question that had troubled her from the beginning. What exactly had gone wrong? For something had gone wrong. She had felt it from the first day, in the village's too uniform acceptance, in the careful way everyone praised Mrs. Crane without quite looking at what they were praising. The unease that had drawn her attention had not been mistaken, but neither had it been what she initially suspected. That evening she sat in her customary chair and thought about plans, about how they were made, what they assumed and where they inevitably failed. Mr. Hargreaves's plan had been meticulous. He had arranged his affairs, written his protective letter, saved his medication, chosen his moment. He had died peacefully, attended by someone who cared for him, in a manner that disturbed no one. By every measure he had established, the plan had succeeded perfectly. Mrs. Crane's execution of her role had been equally precise. She had maintained exactly the right degree of visible devotion without theatrical excess. She had managed his care efficiently, kept the village informed without oversharing, and ensured that his death appeared natural to everyone who might have reason to question it. She had done everything asked of her, and yet. Miss Marple rose and went to her desk, where she kept a small notebook for recording observations, nothing so organised as a diary, merely thoughts that seemed worth preserving. She paged back through recent entries until she found what she was looking for, a note she had made the day after Mr. Hargreaves's funeral. "The village accepts but does not quite settle," she had written. "Agreement without peace." That was it, she realised. That was what had failed. The plan had assumed that resolution could be arranged, that death could be managed so carefully that it left behind no disturbance, no questions, no consequences beyond the practical matters of estate settlement. But human beings, Miss Marple had observed over many years, were not designed to accept such tidy conclusions. They required something more than surface explanations, even when they could not articulate what that something was. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Metcalfe appeared at her door, looking troubled in a way that suggested he had been debating whether to come at all. "Miss Marple, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I find myself in need of a listening ear, and you have such a sensible way of seeing things." They settled in the morning room, and Dr. Metcalfe explained, with several false starts, that he had been thinking about Mr. Hargreaves's death. Medically, everything was straightforward, he said. "Heart failure in an elderly patient with declining health. I've seen it countless times, and yet—" He paused, struggling to articulate something that clearly bothered him. "I keep thinking about the sleeping medication I prescribed. I gave him quite a large bottle, you see, knowing he had difficulty sleeping. When I examined the cottage afterward, I noticed the bottle was nearly empty. I remember thinking it was fortunate he'd had enough to last until the end." "But," Miss Marple prompted gently, "and the timing bothers me. The prescription was filled 6 weeks before his death. A full bottle should have lasted much longer if he was taking them as directed, 1 per night, as needed. For the bottle to be nearly empty suggests he was taking them far more frequently than advised. Or, he trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the implication. Or he was saving them for a different purpose, Miss Marple finished quietly. Dr. Metcalfe looked miserable. I don't like to think it. Mrs. Crane assured me he was comfortable, that he wasn't in distress, but I keep wondering if I should have paid closer attention, asked more questions, if I failed him somehow by not seeing what he might have been planning. Miss Marple considered this carefully. Dr. Metcalfe, if Mr. Hargreaves had made a settled decision about his own end, could you have prevented it? I don't know. Perhaps if I'd been more vigilant, removed the medication, involved Mrs. Crane more explicitly in monitoring. He stopped, shaking his head. That assumes I had a reason to suspect, and at the time I didn't. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Natural decline, faithful friend in attendance, peaceful conclusion. After he left, Miss Marple sat with this new piece of information. Dr. Metcalfe's unease was different from hers, but pointed toward the same fundamental problem. The plan had been too perfect, too carefully managed, and perfection in human affairs almost always signalled something, forced into shape rather than allowed to unfold naturally. She thought about Mrs. Crane, sitting alone in her tidy house, believing she had honoured a debt and granted a wish. She thought about Mr. Hargreaves, choosing his moment with the same precision he had brought to protecting a decades-old silence. She thought about the village, accepting a narrative that satisfied while somehow failing to convince. What had gone wrong, Miss Marple realised, was not the plan itself but the assumption underlying it, the belief that consequences could be contained through careful arrangement, that the past could be settled by simply deciding it was settled, that human complexity could be managed into submission through good intentions and meticulous execution. Mr. Hargreaves had spent decades trying to arrange his life so that his silence protected others from uncomfortable truths. In his final act, he had tried to arrange his death so that it protected everyone, the village from disturbance, Mrs. Crane from suspicion, himself from a prolonged decline he did not wish to endure. But the past, as Miss Marple had observed many times, had a way of refusing to stay arranged. It insisted on asking to be included, on asserting its claims, on making its presence felt even when everyone had agreed to ignore it. The unease she had detected from the beginning was not evidence of a flaw in the plan's execution. It was evidence that the plan itself was fundamentally impossible, that one cannot arrange human endings to exclude human consequences, no matter how carefully one tries. That afternoon she encountered Mrs. Hartnell at the post office. They spoke of ordinary matters, the weather, the upcoming spring fete, Mrs. Hartnell's troublesome nephew, and then Mrs. Hartnell said something that confirmed Miss Marple's understanding. "I've been thinking about Mr. Hargreaves," she said, lowering her voice, "and I can't quite shake the feeling that there was something we all missed. Not anything wrong precisely, just incomplete, as though we attended a play and left before the final act. Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "that's because we were meant to leave before the final act. Some stories are written to end before they're truly finished." Mrs. Hartnell looked puzzled but thoughtful. "I suppose, though it does leave one feeling rather unsettled, doesn't it?" "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "It does indeed." That evening Miss Marple knew she would need to speak with Mrs. Crane once more, not to accuse or condemn, but to explain what she had come to understand, that the flaw in Mr. Hargreaves's final plan had not been in its mechanics but in its ambition. He had tried to exclude consequence from choice, to arrange matters so perfectly that no one would feel disturbed by what had occurred. But people, Miss Marple had learned, needed to feel disturbed sometimes. They needed questions to ask and uncertainties to sit with. They needed the mess and discomfort of truth, even when lies were more convenient. What had failed was not the execution of the plan, but the plan's fundamental premise, that one could die without leaving anything unresolved, that endings could be managed into neatness, that the past could be prevented from asking to be acknowledged. Mr. Hargreaves had tried to arrange a conclusion that would trouble no one. Instead, he had created an arrangement that troubled everyone in ways they could not quite articulate. A perfect surface with nothing underneath. An explanation that answered every question except the ones that actually mattered. The past, Miss Marple reflected, always insists on being included. One can delay it, manage it, arrange around it, but one cannot exclude it. And that, she thought, was what Mr. Hargreaves had never quite understood. Chapter 10. When Certainty Quietly Fails. Miss Marple's final conversation with Mrs. Crane took place 3 days later, on an afternoon when spring had finally asserted itself with genuine warmth and the promise of better weather ahead. They walked together in Mrs. Crane's small garden, where early tulips were beginning to show colour. It seemed easier, somehow, to speak of difficult things while occupied with the simple observation of growing things. "You've spoken with Dr. Metcalfe," Mrs. Crane said. It was not a question. "He came to me with concerns. I listened, as I have listened to many people these past weeks." Miss Marple paused by a bed of emerging daffodils. "He suspects what happened, I think, though he cannot quite allow himself to believe it." "And will he pursue those suspicions?" "No," Miss Marple said with quiet certainty, "because to pursue them would require him to confront his own role, the medication he prescribed, the oversight he did not provide. It is easier to leave questions unasked than to hear answers that implicate oneself." Mrs. Crane nodded slowly. "Then nothing will come of it." "Nothing legal, no? There will be no investigation, no accusation, no formal reckoning?" Miss Marple turned to face her directly. "But that does not mean there will be no consequence." They returned to the small terrace where Mrs. Crane had set out tea. The domestic ritual provided its customary comfort, though both women understood that comfort was temporary at best. "I've been thinking," Mrs. Crane said after a moment, "about what you said regarding Mr. Hargreaves's burden. You were right, he placed me in an impossible position, but I wonder if that wasn't precisely what he intended. Not cruelty, but a kind of sharing. He had carried an impossible weight alone for decades. Perhaps he simply wanted at the end to not be quite so alone in it." Miss Marple considered this. "Perhaps, though that does not make the burden lighter for you." "No, it doesn't." Mrs. Crane's hands wrapped around her teacup, as though seeking warmth despite the mild afternoon. "I find I cannot stay in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple. Everyone has been kind, but their kindness rests on a story that is not quite true. I cannot continue to accept their gratitude for devotion while knowing what I actually did." "Where will you go?" "I have a cousin in Cornwall. She's been asking me to visit for years. I thought perhaps I might stay with her for a time, see what opportunities present themselves." Mrs. Crane smiled faintly. "It seems I have inherited my family's tradition of beginning again elsewhere when the past becomes too present." Miss Marple nodded her understanding. "The village will adjust. They always do." "Will they know the truth?" "They will know enough," Miss Marple said carefully. "Not the details, perhaps, but sufficient to revise their understanding. Dr. Metcalfe's unease will communicate itself. Small contradictions will be noticed in retrospect. The perfect narrative will develop small cracks, and through those cracks, something closer to truth will seep. They will not have certainty, but they will have doubt. And doubt in these matters is often the more honest condition." Mrs. Crane set down her cup. "I did what I believed to be right. I still believe it, even knowing the cost." "I know you do," Miss Marple said gently. "But moral certainty, Mrs. Crane, is most dangerous when it feels most generous. We tell ourselves we are helping, showing compassion, granting mercy, and perhaps we are, but we are also making choices that are not ours alone to make, arranging outcomes that affect more people than we can anticipate. What would you have had me do differently?" "I don't know," Miss Marple admitted. "Perhaps there was no good choice available to you, only difficult ones. But I believe, that Mr. Hargreaves's request should have been refused, not because his suffering was invalid or his wish unreasonable, but because the burden he asked you to carry was too great and the arrangement he proposed could never be as contained as he imagined." They sat in silence for a time, each occupied with thoughts that required no sharing. Finally, Miss Marple rose to leave. At the gate she paused and turned back. Mrs. Crane, you asked what I would have had you do differently. Let me answer more fully. I would have had you tell someone, the vicar, perhaps, or Dr. Metcalfe. I would have had you bring Mr. Hargreaves's wish into the open, where it could be discussed, considered, perhaps even honoured in some modified form that did not require you to act alone. The tragedy here is not that Mr. Hargreaves wished to end his suffering, but that he arranged matters so that you had to shoulder that wish entirely by yourself. Mrs. Crane's eyes glistened. He wanted to protect me. He wanted to protect everyone, Miss Marple corrected gently. But protection that isolates is not kindness, Mrs. Crane. It is simply another form of burden. A week later, Mrs. Crane left St. Mary Mead quietly, just as Mr. Hargreaves had died quietly, with minimal fuss and maximum discretion. The village absorbed her departure with the same careful composure it had brought to his death. Though Miss Marple detected a new quality in the conversations, a slight hesitation, a wondering, a willingness to revise what had previously seemed settled. Dr. Metcalfe never spoke of his suspicions, but his manner became more careful, his professional confidence tempered by something that looked very much like humility. The vicar remarked, in a sermon shortly after Mrs. Crane's departure, that sometimes our certainties about having done right deserve more scrutiny than our certainties about having done wrong. Mr. Hargreaves came to be remembered differently in the village, not better or worse, but more honestly. People spoke less of his peaceful death and more of his isolated life, wondering aloud what choices or sorrows had led a man to live so separately from community. The tidy narrative dissolved gradually, replaced by something messier but more true. Miss Marple, for her part, returned to her routines with the quiet satisfaction